Millionaire disappears with wife's dog. 5 years later, she finds someone who looks like him begging for bread at a traffic light. The traffic light turned red, and Elizabeth Thompson adjusted the rearview mirror of her latest model Mercedes. Her hazel eyes, framed by small wrinkles that betrayed sleepless nights, settled on the figure approaching between the cars. A disheveled man with a thick beard and worn clothes walked clumsily among the stopped vehicles, extending his hand in search of some coins. Elizabeth's heart stopped for a moment. There was something unsettlingly familiar about that figure. The way he slightly tilted his head to the right, the peculiar way of moving his hands, even the way he walked, despite the evident physical deterioration. Everything about him reminded her of Jack, her first husband, who had disappeared 5 years ago under circumstances she never managed to understand. "It can't be him," she muttered to herself as her fingers nervously drummed on the steering wheel. The man was approaching her window, and Elizabeth felt the air becoming denser inside the car. Her hands began to tremble, and the ring from her current marriage to Richard seemed to weigh a ton on her ring finger. The man reached her window. Elizabeth held her breath. The homeless man's eyes, though clouded by something that seemed to be confusion, had that same jade-green tone she had contemplated so many times during her years of marriage to Jack. But there was something else in that gaze, something that deeply disturbed her, a flash of recognition that disappeared as quickly as it came. "Jack," Elizabeth whispered, her voice broken with emotion. The man stepped back as if he had received an electric shock. His eyes opened wide, and for a second Elizabeth swore she saw panic in his expression. Without saying a word, the man hurriedly walked away, losing himself among the cars that were beginning to move as the traffic light changed to green. The honking of impatient drivers snapped Elizabeth out of her trance. With trembling hands, she drove to the next street and parked the car. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions and mixed emotions. Could it really be him? Or was her obsession with finding answers leading her to see ghosts where there were none? She took her phone out of her purse and dialed a number she hadn't used in a long time. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Detective Johnson speaking." "This is Elizabeth Thompson," she said, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "I need your services again." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Detective Johnson had exhaustively investigated Jack's case during the first 2 years after his disappearance, without any success. "Mrs. Thompson, I thought you had decided to move on with your life," he replied cautiously. "I had," Elizabeth admitted, as she watched the direction where the mysterious man had disappeared. "But I just saw someone that changes everything." The detective sighed on the other end of the line. "I'm listening." Elizabeth began to recount her encounter, each word rekindling the flame of hope that had never completely extinguished. As she spoke, her mind wandered to the memories of that morning 5 years ago, when Jack left home taking Max, the family's beloved dog, with him and never returned. "I need you to help me find him," Elizabeth concluded. "This time it's different. This time I'm certain he's here in the city." "What about your current husband?" Johnson asked. "Is Richard okay with this?" Elizabeth remained silent for a moment. Richard had been her support for the last 3 years, helping her rebuild her life when everything seemed lost. But there were things he could never understand, questions that needed answers. "There are truths that cannot remain buried forever," she finally responded. "I need to know what really happened. For me, for Max, and yes, for Jack too." Detective Johnson agreed to meet her that same afternoon. As Elizabeth put away her phone, a feeling of unease overtook her, not only because of the possibility of having found Jack, but because of something else that deeply disturbed her. If it really was him, what had happened to reduce him to that state? And more importantly, where was Max, the faithful companion he had taken with him on the day of his disappearance? The afternoon was beginning to fall over New York City, and Elizabeth felt she was about to embark on a journey that would change her life forever. What she didn't know was that fate had surprises in store for her that not even she, with all her determination, could have anticipated. Detective Johnson's office hadn't changed in the last 3 years. The same vertical blinds filtered the late afternoon light, creating elongated shadows on the worn wooden desk. Elizabeth sat in the same chair where years ago she had shed so many tears of frustration when the leads on Jack kept running dry one after another. "Tell me exactly what you saw, Mrs. Thompson," Johnson asked as he poured 2 cups of coffee. The bitter aroma filled the small office, mixing with the smell of old paper and the years of unsolved mysteries that seemed to permeate the walls. Elizabeth described every detail of the encounter at the traffic light, every gesture of the mysterious man, every sensation she had experienced. Her hands moved nervously as she spoke, making the gold bracelets on her wrist jingle. "And you're sure he reacted when you mentioned Jack's name?" the detective asked, leaning forward with renewed interest. "Completely," Elizabeth affirmed. "His eyes. There was a moment of recognition, I'm sure. And then panic. As if he had been discovered." Johnson got up and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner of the office. He pulled out a thick folder, yellowed by the passage of time, Jack Thompson's file. "Let's review the facts," he said, opening the folder. 5 years ago, Jack left home early like any other day. He took Max, saying he would take him to the vet for his monthly checkup. Elizabeth nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. "They never made it to the vet. I called worried when he wasn't responding to my messages, and Dr. Martinez told me he didn't have any appointment scheduled for that day. Security cameras caught him leaving the city in his black BMW," Johnson continued, flipping through the file. "After that, nothing. The car appeared 3 days later in an airport parking lot, but there were no records of Jack having taken any flight. And Max just disappeared with him," Elizabeth completed, her voice breaking. "Do you know how many nights I've spent wondering why he took our dog? Max was part of our family. We had him since he was a puppy. It doesn't make sense." The detective pulled a photograph from the file. In it, Jack smiled at the camera, elegantly dressed in a dark suit, holding a business award. Next to him, Max, a beautiful German shepherd, sat obediently, his characteristic black and tan coat shining under the event lights. "Do you remember anything unusual in the days before his disappearance?" Johnson asked, though they had gone over these details hundreds of times before. Elizabeth closed her eyes, trying to remember. "The only thing that seemed strange to me was that he was spending more time in his office in the old building, the one he had inherited from his father. He said he was organizing important documents." "The building that Richard sold after your marriage," Johnson pointed out. "Yes," Elizabeth responded, feeling a pang of guilt. "Richard insisted it was for the best, that we needed to close that chapter, but I always wondered if we hadn't lost some important clue by selling it." The detective adjusted his glasses and looked intently at Elizabeth. "Does your current husband know you're here?" Elizabeth shook her head. "Richard is a good man. He helped me when I needed it most, but he never understood my need for answers. He believes Jack simply abandoned us, that he ran off with the company's money and that we should leave it in the past." "And what do you believe?" Johnson asked, though he knew the answer. "I believe there's something more," Elizabeth responded firmly. "Jack could be many things, but he loved Max. He would never have willingly exposed him to a dangerous situation. And if he really planned his disappearance, why take the dog? It doesn't make sense." Johnson nodded slowly, closing the file. "I'll need time to organize the search. The man you saw might frequent that area. I'll put my contacts on watching the zone." Elizabeth stood up, taking an envelope from her purse. "Money is not an issue. I just need to know the truth." As she was about to leave the office, Johnson called out, "Mrs. Thompson, one last thing. If it really was Jack, and if he's living on the streets as you say, something very serious must have happened to him. Are you prepared to face that truth, whatever it may be?" Elizabeth paused in the doorframe, her silhouette outlined against the hallway light. "I've lived 5 years with uncertainty, Detective. Any truth is better than this." As she descended the stairs of the building, Elizabeth couldn't get the image of Max out of her mind. Where could he be? Had he survived all these years? The idea of their beloved pet wandering the streets, or worse, caused her physical pain in her chest. What Elizabeth didn't know was that, at that very moment, fate was preparing another encounter that would shake the foundations of everything she thought she knew about Jack's disappearance. Night had fallen over New York City when Elizabeth finally arrived at her home in the Upper East Side. The mansion, with its expansive gardens and modern architecture, represented the life she had built with Richard over the last 3 years. However, tonight, the warm lights shining through the large windows seemed strangely alien to her. As she searched for her keys in her purse, a distant sound caught her attention. A bark. Something about that sound paralyzed her. It wasn't just any bark. There was a familiarity to it that sent chills down her spine. She stood motionless, holding her breath, waiting to hear it again. The bark repeated, this time closer, more desperate. Elizabeth dropped her keys. That tone, that particular cadence. Only one dog had ever barked like that in her life. "Max," she whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible. As if responding to her call, a shadow moved among the bushes bordering the property. Elizabeth slowly approached, her heart beating so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The moonlight partially illuminated the figure of a large dog, a German shepherd that, although dirty and visibly neglected, maintained that noble posture she remembered so well. "Max," she repeated, this time with more strength. "Is that you, my love?" The dog took a step forward, and Elizabeth stifled a cry. It was him. Despite the years that had passed, despite his deplorable state, there was no doubt. Those amber eyes that looked at her with a mixture of recognition and caution were unmistakable. The small white mark on his chest, shaped like a half-moon, confirmed the impossible. Max had returned. Elizabeth knelt slowly, extending her hand. "Come here, my boy. Come to Mommy." Max approached with hesitant steps. His coat, once lustrous and shiny, was now dull and matted. He had visible scars on his paws and an expression of weariness that broke Elizabeth's heart. When he finally reached her, the dog gently rested his head in her hand, and Elizabeth felt tears begin to run down her cheeks. "Where have you been?" she murmured as she carefully caressed him. "What happened to you, my love?" The sound of an approaching car startled them both. Max tensed immediately, and Elizabeth recognized the noise of Richard's Mercedes engine. The dog took a step back, but Elizabeth gently held him by the neck. "No, don't go. Please stay." Richard parked the car and got out with his executive briefcase. He stopped short when he saw Elizabeth kneeling next to the dog. "Elizabeth, what are you doing there? Where did that dog come from?" "Richard." Elizabeth slowly stood up, not letting go of Max. "It's him. It's Max." Her husband approached cautiously, scrutinizing the animal. "Max? Jack's dog? Elizabeth, that's impossible. It's been 5 years." "It's him," Elizabeth insisted, with a certainty that admitted no doubts. "I'd recognize him anywhere." Richard observed the dog with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Elizabeth, darling, I know what this day means to you. I saw the missed calls from Detective Johnson, but this can't be good for you." Max growled softly when Richard tried to get closer, a low and threatening sound that surprised Elizabeth. He had never been an aggressive dog. "He's scared," Elizabeth justified. "He's been through a lot. He just needs time." "Elizabeth," Richard spoke with that soft tone he used when he wanted to make her see reason. "We can't keep him. He's a stray dog. He could be dangerous." "He's not a stray dog," Elizabeth's voice became firm. "He's Max, and he's staying with us. I'm not abandoning him again." Something in her tone must have convinced Richard that it was useless to argue. With a sigh of resignation, he took out the house keys. "At least bathe him before bringing him in. And first thing tomorrow, we're taking him to the vet." Elizabeth nodded, grateful for the small victory. As she guided Max towards the house, she noticed something glinting faintly on his old collar, a small charm she didn't remember seeing before. She tried to examine it, but Max shook uneasily when her fingers approached the object. Once inside the house, as she prepared the bath for Max, Elizabeth couldn't stop thinking about the extraordinary coincidence. First the man who could be Jack, and now Max. After 5 years of silence, why did both appear on the same day? What Elizabeth didn't know was that the small charm on Max's collar held a secret that would forever change her understanding of what happened that morning 5 years ago, when her life began to crumble. Warm water ran through Max's fur, washing away years of dirt and gradually revealing the elegant German shepherd that Elizabeth remembered. As she bathed him carefully in the spacious service bathroom, her fingers found new scars that told silent stories of survival. "What happened to you, my love?" Elizabeth whispered, gently massaging the knots in his fur. "Where have you been all this time?" Max remained strangely still, as if he understood the importance of the moment. His amber eyes never left Elizabeth, following each of her movements with an intensity that disturbed her. It was the same attentive gaze he had when Jack was around, as if he were waiting for something. While rinsing the shampoo, Elizabeth took the opportunity to examine the charm hanging from the deteriorated collar more closely. It was a small metal piece, apparently silver, with an octagonal shape. On one of its faces was an engraved inscription, 2307 Aurora building. Elizabeth felt her heart skip a beat. The Aurora building was precisely the old office building that Jack had inherited from his father, the same one that Richard had insisted on selling after their marriage. And 23:07. Could it be a date? July 23rd. Elizabeth, Richard's voice from the door startled her. Dinner is ready. I'm almost done, she responded, trying to maintain a casual tone as she dried Max with a soft towel. Richard leaned against the doorframe, observing the scene with a mixture of concern and resignation. I called Dr. Martinez. He can see us first thing tomorrow morning. Thank you, said Elizabeth, although her mind was elsewhere. Dr. Martinez was the same veterinarian who was supposedly supposed to have seen Max the day Jack disappeared. As she finished drying Max, Elizabeth noticed something else. Every time her hands approached the charm, the dog tensed slightly. It was a subtle change in his behavior, but after so many years together, Elizabeth knew each of his reactions. Do you want me to prepare a place for him in the garage? Richard asked. No, Elizabeth's response was immediate and firm. He'll sleep in the house. In my study. Elizabeth, Richard began with a warning tone. It's just temporary, she interrupted him, though they both knew it wasn't true. Until he adjusts. Richard sighed deeply. Just be careful, okay? We don't know why he came back after so long. Elizabeth nodded distractedly as she guided Max to her study. The room, with its walls covered in books and a comfortable sofa by the window, had been her refuge during the years of uncertainty. Now, with Max back, the space seemed to take on new meaning. She prepared an improvised bed with soft blankets and an old cushion. Max settled in immediately as if he recognized the scent of his former owner in every corner. However, his eyes remained alert, watchful. Rest, my love, Elizabeth whispered, gently stroking his head. Tomorrow will be a new day. Before leaving, she took out her phone and discreetly photographed the charm. She sent the image to Detective Johnson with a brief message. Need to see you tomorrow after the vet visit. Max is back, and he brought something with him. During dinner, Elizabeth barely touched her food. Her mind kept spinning around the coincidences of the day, the man at the traffic light, Max's return, the mysterious charm with the reference to the Aurora building. Each piece seemed part of a larger puzzle that was beginning to take shape. Everything okay? Richard asked, noticing her distraction. Yes, Elizabeth lied, forcing a smile. I'm just tired. That night, while Richard slept, Elizabeth snuck quietly into her study. Max raised his head immediately upon seeing her enter, as if he had been waiting for her return. You know something, don't you? She whispered, sitting next to him. You know where Jack is? In response, Max rested his head on her lap, but his eyes seemed to confirm what Elizabeth suspected. The dog's return was not a coincidence. It was the first step towards a truth that had remained hidden for 5 long years. What Elizabeth couldn't imagine was that this truth would prove more disturbing than she had ever expected, and that the charm on Max's collar was just the tip of the iceberg of a mystery that would forever change her perspective on the man she once loved. The waiting room of Dr. Martinez's veterinary clinic smelled of disinfectant and freshly brewed coffee. Elizabeth sat restlessly in one of the plastic chairs, while Max lay at her feet, his head erect and alert. The wall clock marked 8:15 a.m., and the silence was only interrupted by the occasional bark coming from the inner rooms. Richard had insisted on accompanying her, but Elizabeth convinced him she could handle it alone. She needed this moment, needed to talk to Dr. Martinez without her current husband's watchful presence. Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Martinez's voice sounded exactly as she remembered it. The veterinarian, a middle-aged man with gold-rimmed glasses, froze in the doorway of his office. And Max? Elizabeth nodded, standing up. He's back, Doctor. He appeared at my house last night. Dr. Martinez slowly crouched in front of Max, extending his hand. The dog sniffed him cautiously, but showed no signs of recognition. After so long, the veterinarian muttered, more to himself than to Elizabeth. Please come in. Once in the office, as the doctor examined Max, Elizabeth observed every reaction, every gesture. There was something in the way the veterinarian avoided her gaze that unsettled her. The scars on his paws, Elizabeth pointed out. Can you tell me what caused them? Dr. Martinez adjusted his glasses, examining the marks with professional attention. They look like wounds from struggling. as if he had tried to escape from somewhere, maybe through a fence or a window with metal protection. Elizabeth felt a chill. And his general condition? Considering the circumstances, he's surprisingly well, the veterinarian responded, palpating Max's abdomen. He's somewhat malnourished, but not severely. Someone must have been feeding him during this time. Dr. Martinez, Elizabeth took a deep breath before continuing. I need to ask you something about the day Jack disappeared. The veterinarian visibly tensed. Mrs. Thompson, we talked about this years ago. As I told you then, I had no scheduled appointment for that day. I know. Elizabeth leaned forward. But there's something I never asked you. Had Jack brought Max in the days before? Did you notice anything unusual? Dr. Martinez took off his glasses and began cleaning them nervously with his coat. Mrs. Thompson, please, Elizabeth insisted. It's been 5 years. If you know anything, no matter how small. The veterinarian seemed to wage an internal battle before responding. Jack brought Max in a week before he disappeared. Not for a checkup, but to request his complete medical history and an international vaccination card. Elizabeth felt the air escape from her lungs. An international card? Why didn't you tell me this before? Because Jack specifically asked me not to mention it, the doctor admitted, avoiding her gaze. He said it was a surprise that they were planning a family trip. Max, who had remained calm on the examination table until that moment, began to agitate when the doctor mentioned the word trip. His ears flattened against his head, and a low growl emerged from his throat. Easy, my love, Elizabeth whispered, gently stroking his back. But there was something in Max's reaction that confirmed her suspicions. The dog remembered something related to that supposed trip that never happened. There's something else, Dr. Martinez added after a moment of hesitation. The day he came for the documents, Jack seemed nervous, not like someone planning a vacation, but like someone who what, doctor? Elizabeth pressed. Like someone who's running away, the veterinarian completed in a low voice. Elizabeth took out her phone and showed the photo of the charm to the doctor. Do you recognize this? Was it on Max's collar when Jack brought him in? Dr. Martinez examined the image carefully. No, I had never seen that charm. The collar was new that day, but it didn't have any ornaments. As the veterinarian finished the examination and prepared the vitamins and medications necessary for Max's recovery, Elizabeth couldn't stop thinking about this new information. Jack had planned his disappearance, that was evident now. But why take Max? And why had the dog returned precisely now? As she left the clinic, Elizabeth received a message from Detective Johnson. Aurora Building, 11:20 a.m. Found something you need to see. Elizabeth looked at Max, who walked obediently by her side, the charm glinting faintly on his collar under the morning sun. Each answer seemed to generate more questions, but one thing was clear. Max's return was not the end of the story, but just the beginning of a truth that had remained hidden for 5 years. What Elizabeth didn't know was that in less than an hour, at the Aurora Building, Detective Johnson would show her something that would connect all the pieces in a way she could never have imagined. The Aurora Building stood like a ghost from the past, amidst the bustle of the modern city. Its red brick walls and Art Deco windows contrasted with the glass skyscrapers surrounding it. Elizabeth parked her car on the side street, feeling her heart race as she saw the facade that brought back so many memories. Max, sitting in the passenger seat, began to grow restless as soon as the building came into view. His ears moved nervously, and his breathing became agitated. You feel it too, don't you? Elizabeth whispered, gently stroking his head. This place holds secrets. Detective Johnson was waiting for them at the entrance, his robust figure silhouetted against the main door. In his hands, he held a bundle of old keys and a manila folder. Good morning, Mrs. Thompson, he greeted, and then looked at Max with genuine surprise. So, it's true, he's back. Max kept his distance from the detective, staying close to Elizabeth, but never taking his eyes off the building. How did you get access? Elizabeth asked as they followed the detective inside. The new owner is an old friend, Johnson replied, as he inserted a key into the main lock. I told him I needed to check some details from a previous investigation. The lobby of the building was shrouded in a dusty gloom. Their footsteps echoed on the worn marble floor, raising small clouds of dust that danced in the rays of light, filtering through the dirty windows. Jack's office was on the 3rd floor, Elizabeth remembered, heading towards the stairs. However, Max stopped abruptly, resisting the urge to follow. "Interesting," Johnson murmured, observing the dog's reaction. "Is he afraid to go up?" "No," Elizabeth replied, studying Max's behavior. "It's as if he wants to go somewhere else." Max began to gently pull on his leash, guiding them towards a side door that Elizabeth had never noticed before. It was a small entrance, almost hidden behind an ornamental column. "The basement," Johnson explained. According to the original plans, it was used as an archive. The door opened with a metallic squeak that seemed to awaken dormant echoes. Max went ahead, pulling more forcefully on the leash, his nose glued to the ground as if following an invisible trail. "Careful," Johnson warned, turning on a flashlight. "The stairs are steep." The basement was a large, cold space, with metal shelves that disappeared into the darkness. The beam of the flashlight revealed old boxes and file cabinets, covered by years of abandonment. Suddenly, Max stopped in front of an apparently solid wall and began to scratch the floor insistently. "Here," Johnson pointed, directing the flashlight beam to the exact spot. "This is what I wanted to show you." Elizabeth approached and noticed something peculiar about the wall, an almost imperceptible line that formed a rectangle. "It's a hidden door," Johnson explained. "I found it while reviewing the original building plans. It doesn't appear in the more recent records." Carefully, Johnson pressed a specific point on the wall, and with a metallic click, the panel moved, revealing a hidden space. Max entered immediately, his tail moving for the first time since they arrived at the building. The space was small, barely the size of a modest office. But what caught Elizabeth's attention were the walls. They were covered with photographs, documents, and maps, all connected by colored threads, like an elaborate version of an investigation board. "Oh my God," Elizabeth whispered, recognizing Jack's handwriting in the notes covering the documents. "This was his real office," Johnson said, illuminating different sections of the wall. "And from what I can see, he was investigating something big." Max sat in the center of the room, his eyes shining in the dim light as he watched Elizabeth examine the walls. The charm on his collar seemed to catch a flash of the flashlight, as if wanting to remind them of its presence. Elizabeth approached one of the photographs. It showed a group of men in what appeared to be an informal meeting. She recognized Jack among them, but his expression was tense, almost fearful. The date in the corner of the photo was just a week before his disappearance. "Detective," Elizabeth called, her voice trembling slightly. "This date, it coincides with Jack's visit to the vet to get Max's documents." Johnson approached to examine the photo more closely. "And look at this." He pointed to a detail in the background of the image. "The logo on the wall. It's from Eagle Corporation." "The company that went bankrupt 4 years ago?" Elizabeth asked, feeling the pieces starting to fit together. "The same," Johnson confirmed. "And if I'm not mistaken, your current husband, Richard, was the one who handled the liquidation of its assets." Elizabeth felt the ground move beneath her feet. Max approached her, resting his head against her leg, as if he sensed her disturbance. What they had discovered in this hidden basement was just the beginning. The walls held secrets that connected the past with the present in ways that Elizabeth was only beginning to understand, and each new revelation brought her closer to a truth that could destroy not only her past, but also her present. Detective Johnson's flashlight danced over the documents covering the walls, revealing an intricate network of connections that Jack had meticulously built. Elizabeth approached a particular section that seemed to be the center of the entire investigation. "Eagle Corporation," she murmured, running her fingers over the yellowed newspaper clippings. Why was Jack so interested in this company? Max remained seated next to her, his amber eyes reflecting the light as he followed her every move. Detective Johnson approached with a folder he had found on an old desk in the corner. "Look at this," he said, spreading several documents over a dusty surface. "They're financial reports, but there's something strange about them." Jack marked them with red ink. Elizabeth leaned over the papers, recognizing her ex-husband's characteristic handwriting in the marginal notes. "Irregular transfers," she read aloud, "unjustified funds, ghost accounts." "And here's the most interesting part," Johnson pointed out, illuminating a specific date. "All these suspicious transactions began 3 months before Richard took control of Eagle Corporation's liquidation." Elizabeth felt her throat tighten. "Are you suggesting that Richard—" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," the detective interrupted cautiously, "but it's evident that Jack discovered something that disturbed him enough to create this secret space." Max, who had remained still until that moment, suddenly got up and headed towards a corner of the room. He began to scratch insistently at a section of the floor. "What did you find, my love?" Elizabeth approached, noticing that one of the floorboards seemed to be loose. With the detective's help, they managed to lift the board, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside was a metal box the size of a book. "We need to open it," Elizabeth said urgently. Johnson manipulated the lock with expertise, and the box opened with a click. Inside they found a USB drive, a small notebook, and a sealed envelope with Elizabeth's name written in Jack's characteristic handwriting. With trembling hands, Elizabeth opened the envelope. The letter inside was dated the day before his disappearance. "Dear Elizabeth, if you're reading this, it means something went wrong. I've uncovered irregularities that could destroy many lives. I can't explain everything now, but you should know that every decision I made was to protect you. I took Max with me because he is the only living proof of what I witnessed that night at Eagle Corporation's offices. His scars tell a story that will need to be told at the right time. The charm on his collar contains coordinates. When it's safe, Max will know how to find his way back to you. Don't trust..." The letter ended abruptly, as if Jack had been interrupted while writing it. "The coordinates," Elizabeth murmured, remembering the charm. She examined it again under the light. The numbers engraved on the back, which she had previously interpreted as a date, now took on a new meaning. Johnson was already entering the numbers into his phone. "They point to a location on the outskirts of the city," he reported, "an abandoned industrial zone." Max let out a soft whimper, and Elizabeth noticed that his eyes were fixed on one of the photographs on the wall. It showed the interior of a warehouse, and in a corner, barely visible, a large cage could be distinguished. "The scars on his paws," Elizabeth whispered, the pieces fitting together in her mind like a macabre puzzle. "He wasn't trying to escape from just any window or fence. He was trying to escape from that place," Johnson completed, his voice grave in the dimness of the basement. The sound of footsteps on the floor above startled them. Max tensed immediately, his ears alert and a low growl forming in his throat. "Someone else is in the building," Johnson whispered, turning off the flashlight. Elizabeth quickly tucked the letter and documents into her purse while the detective closed the metal box. The footsteps were approaching the basement stairs. "The secret door," Johnson indicated in a low voice. "Quickly." As they hid behind the panel, closing it silently, Elizabeth couldn't stop thinking about the last incomplete words of Jack's letter. Don't trust. Who shouldn't she trust? Richard? Someone else from Eagle Corporation? Or perhaps the person now descending the basement stairs, their footsteps echoing ever closer to their hiding place? The silence in the hidden space was so dense that Elizabeth could hear her own heartbeat. Max, pressed against her legs, maintained an unnatural stillness, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Detective Johnson, beside them, held his breath as the footsteps in the basement drew ever closer. "It must be around here," a male voice resonated in the outer space. "Richard said there was a secret compartment." Elizabeth felt her blood run cold. Richard? Her Richard knew about this place. "Are you sure Thompson kept documents here?" asked a second voice, deeper and more authoritative. "According to our sources, yes. The woman and the dog came here this morning." "If they found something..." Max emitted a growl so low that only Elizabeth could feel it, a barely perceptible vibration against her leg. She placed a gentle hand on his head, silently begging him to stay calm. "Check every inch," ordered the deep voice. "We can't allow those documents to come to light. The corporation has worked too hard to keep this quiet." The sound of furniture being moved and papers being shuffled filled the air. Elizabeth could see, through a small crack in the panel, the shadows of the men moving around the basement. "Boss!" called the first voice. "Look at this. There are recent marks on the floor." The footsteps dangerously approached the wall where they were hiding. Detective Johnson instinctively moved his hand towards his side, where Elizabeth assumed he carried his weapon. Suddenly, a phone rang in the basement. The echo of the melody bounced off the concrete walls. "Yes?" the deep voice answered. "Are you sure? At the veterinary clinic?" "I understand. We're on our way." The sound of footsteps moving away brought a moment of temporary relief. "The woman took the dog to the vet this morning," they explained to their companion as they headed towards the stairs. "Dr. Martinez might have useful information." When the echo of the footsteps finally faded, Elizabeth felt her legs give way. The detective held her before she could fall. "Dr. Martinez," she whispered in horror. "They're going after him." "We need to get him out of there," Johnson agreed, carefully opening the panel. "But first, we need to secure these documents." As they exited their hiding place, the basement showed signs of the search: scattered papers, overturned furniture, opened boxes. Max immediately headed towards a corner and began to dig among the debris, until he revealed another envelope that had been hidden under a pile of fallen documents. Elizabeth took it with trembling hands. Inside was a memory card and another note from Jack. "If you're reading this, it means you found the first hiding place. There's more, Elizabeth, much more. Each piece is protected, scattered in places that only Max knows. He is the key, the only one who can guide you through this labyrinth. Keep the card safe. It contains videos of meetings that should never have existed, conversations that should never have been recorded. But above all, protect Max. They know he's the only witness who can connect all the dots." "We need to get out of here," Johnson urged, storing the card in an inner pocket of his jacket. "And we have to warn Dr. Martinez." As they hurriedly climbed the basement stairs, Elizabeth couldn't stop thinking about Richard. How much did her husband really know? Had he been part of all this from the beginning? Jack's incomplete words echoed in her mind. "Don't trust—" Max was guiding them towards the exit, his behavior completely transformed. He no longer seemed like the scared and mistreated dog that had appeared in her garden. Now he moved with purpose, as if each step was part of a larger plan. Upon reaching the street, Detective Johnson quickly headed to his car. "I'll go to the veterinary clinic. You take Max to a safe place." "But where?" Elizabeth asked, desperation seeping into her voice. "If Richard is involved, I can't go home." "I know a place," Johnson replied, handing her a hastily written address. "It's a safe house I use for protected witnesses. Go there and wait for my call." As Elizabeth got into her car with Max, a new determination formed within her. It was no longer just the search for Jack that moved her. Now she was immersed in something much bigger, a conspiracy that had claimed too many victims and threatened to claim more. What she didn't know was that in the next few hours, every certainty she had about her present and past life would be put to the test, and that the truth she so longed to find would prove to be more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The safe house turned out to be a modest apartment in an old building in the city center. Elizabeth followed Detective Johnson's instructions, finding the key exactly where he had indicated, under a cracked flower pot in the third-floor hallway. The interior was austere but clean. A small living room, a basic kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom. The windows had thick curtains that barely let in the evening light, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. "Welcome to our temporary refuge," Elizabeth whispered to Max, who immediately began to inspect every corner of the apartment, his nose working tirelessly. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from Richard. "Where are you?" "I stopped by the vet and they said you never arrived." Elizabeth felt a chill. Richard's lie confirmed her worst suspicions. She turned off the phone and took out the one Johnson had given her for emergencies. Max stopped in front of an old television, barking softly. Elizabeth approached and noticed there was a DVD player connected. An idea crossed her mind. "The memory card," she murmured, taking it out of her purse. After a few attempts, she managed to connect it to the television. The screen came to life, showing a series of video files dated 5 years ago. With trembling hands, Elizabeth selected the first one. The image showed an elegant boardroom. Elizabeth immediately recognized the Eagle Corporation logo on the wall. Jack was sitting in a corner, apparently recording the meeting discreetly with his phone. "The funds must be redirected before the external auditors arrive," a man in a dark suit that Elizabeth didn't recognize was saying. "Thompson, we need your cooperation on this." "I'm not sure." Jack's voice sounded tense. "What you're proposing is—" "It's necessary," interrupted another voice that made Elizabeth freeze. It was Richard, 5 years younger but unmistakable. "The corporation can't afford a scandal now." Max growled softly upon hearing Richard's voice, confirming Elizabeth's fears. The video continued, revealing an elaborate network of financial manipulation. But what most impacted Elizabeth was seeing how Jack seemed increasingly uncomfortable, more frightened with each subsequent meeting. In the last video, dated 2 days before his disappearance, Jack was alone in his office, speaking directly to the camera. "Elizabeth, If you're seeing this, it means I managed to get the evidence to you. What I discovered at Eagle Corporation goes beyond simple fraud. They're using shell companies to... Wait, someone's coming. The recording ended abruptly, but not before the camera captured Max entering the office, followed by shadows moving in the background. Elizabeth brought her hands to her mouth, tears freely running down her cheeks. Max approached her, resting his head on her lap. "You were there," she whispered, stroking his head. "You saw what happened that night." The sound of a key in the lock startled her. Max immediately went on alert, but relaxed upon seeing Detective Johnson enter. "Dr. Martinez is safe," he reported, locking the door behind him. "I got him out of the clinic just in time. He's in another safe house." "Detective," Elizabeth pointed to the television. "The videos. Richard is involved." "He's been involved from the beginning." Johnson nodded gravely. "I feared as much. That's why we need to act quickly. Dr. Martinez told me something else. The night before he disappeared, Jack entrusted him with a sealed box. He told him to only hand it over if Max returned." "A box?" Elizabeth sat up. "Where is it?" "In a safe place," Johnson replied. "But there's something more." The doctor remembered something about that last visit. He said Jack mentioned a name, Aurora Valdez. Elizabeth felt the air leave her lungs. "Aurora? Like the Aurora building?" "Exactly," Johnson confirmed, "and I just discovered that Aurora Valdez was the former owner of the building, before Jack's father acquired it. She passed away 15 years ago, but her daughter..." A sharp bark from Max interrupted him. The dog was in front of the window, his posture rigid and alert. "What's wrong?" Elizabeth whispered, cautiously approaching. Through the curtains, she could see a black car parked in front of the building. Two men got out, and one of them looked directly up at their window. "They found us," Johnson murmured, drawing his weapon. "We have to get out of here now." "There's an emergency exit through the kitchen," Johnson whispered, as he quickly tucked the memory card into his jacket. "It leads to an alley that connects with the parallel street." Elizabeth gathered her purse with trembling hands, making sure all the documents found in the Aurora building were inside. Max remained alert, his ears moving at every sound coming from the hallway. The echo of footsteps climbing the stairs resonated in the building. Elizabeth recognized the characteristic ping of the old elevator starting up. "They're coming from both sides," Johnson murmured. "Follow me and don't make a sound." They slipped into the kitchen, where a small window gave access to the fire escape. The rusty metal creaked softly under their feet as they began the descent. Max, to Elizabeth's surprise, moved with extraordinary agility, as if he had done this before. Just as they reached the second floor, voices and footsteps were heard above. The door of the apartment they had just abandoned opened with a bang. "Check the entire building," ordered a familiar voice that made Elizabeth stop in her tracks. It was Richard. "Don't stop," Johnson urged in a low voice, taking her by the arm. "We have to get to the alley." They continued descending, each step measured, each movement calculated to make the least noise possible. The evening sky had turned an intense orange, casting elongated shadows in the alley below them. When they were one floor away from reaching the ground, Max stopped abruptly, his body tense. A second later, a door opened in the alley, and two men emerged, looking in all directions. "Up there," Johnson whispered, pointing to an open window on the second floor of the adjacent building. "It's our only option." With her heart pounding in her ears, Elizabeth followed the detective. Max moved between them, always maintaining a protective position. The window led to what appeared to be an abandoned office, filled with desks covered with dusty sheets. "This way," Johnson indicated, guiding them towards an interior hallway. "This building connects to the main avenue." As they advanced in the twilight, Elizabeth heard Richard's voice again, this time from the alley. "The dog is the key. Without him, they can't prove anything. Find him." Max emitted a low growl, and Elizabeth noticed that the charm on his collar glowed faintly in the darkness. It was then that she remembered something she had seen in the Aurora building documents, an old blueprint showing a network of tunnels connecting several downtown buildings. "Detective," she whispered, "is it possible that these old buildings are connected underground?" Johnson stopped, considering the idea. "The service tunnels, yes, it's possible. During the golden age of downtown, many buildings shared maintenance systems." As if confirming his words, Max began to gently pull on his leash towards a door marked "Maintenance." Behind it, a staircase descended into darkness. "It's risky," Johnson warned, "but it could be our best option." The sound of voices and footsteps approaching down the hallway made the decision for them. Quickly, they entered through the door and closed it behind them. The emergency phone's flashlight revealed a network of tunnels extending in various directions. Max seemed strangely familiar with the place, guiding them with certainty through the passages. Their footsteps echoed softly on the damp concrete, while the distant echo of the search above gradually faded. "He was here," Elizabeth murmured, observing how Max navigated the tunnels without hesitation. "Jack used these tunnels, didn't he?" "And I think I know why," Johnson responded, illuminating a mark on the wall, a symbol identical to the one on Max's collar charm. "He left a path for us to follow, but only when it was safe to do so." Elizabeth touched the symbol with trembling fingers. "Where are you taking us, Max?" The dog stopped in front of an intersection, his head tilted as if listening to something. In the distance, a familiar sound began to take shape, the murmur of running water. "The underground river," Johnson whispered. "These tunnels must connect with the city's old drainage system." Max barked softly, confirming the discovery. On his collar, the charm seemed to glow more intensely, as if responding to an invisible signal. What none of them knew was that, while they delved deeper into the network of tunnels, up in the city, Richard was making a call that would change the course of events. "We found her, and she has the dog with her, but there's something else, that she's with Johnson." The tunnel narrowed as they advanced, the sound of water growing more intense with each step. Detective Johnson's flashlight cast dancing shadows on the damp walls, creating ghostly figures that seemed to watch them from the darkness. "These tunnels must be over a century old," Johnson commented, illuminating ancient markings on the walls. "They were built during the city's expansion era." Max occasionally stopped at certain intersections, his nose working intensely before choosing a direction. The charm on his collar emitted faint flashes each time they approached one of the symbols on the walls. "They're not coincidences," Elizabeth murmured, studying one of the symbols more closely. "Look at this, detective. The marks are different from the original tunnel ones, they're more recent." Johnson focused the light on the point Elizabeth was indicating. Indeed, over the ancient builders' marks, there were additional symbols, almost imperceptible to those who didn't know to look for them. Jack created a navigation system, the detective concluded. Using the old tunnels as a base, he established secret routes. A metallic sound resonated in the distance, causing Max to stop abruptly. His ears moved, catching something the humans couldn't perceive. "Someone else is down here," Johnson whispered, turning off the flashlight. They remained motionless in the darkness while the echo of distant footsteps bounced off the tunnel walls. Max pressed against Elizabeth's legs, his body tense but not making a sound. "This way," Johnson indicated in a low voice, guiding them towards a lateral opening they had barely noticed. The space they entered was larger, a kind of ancient chamber that had probably served as a maintenance station. Old rusty tools and deteriorated boxes were piled in the corners. Max headed directly to a specific corner, beginning to dig among the debris. Elizabeth knelt beside him, helping to remove the years of accumulated abandonment. "This..." Elizabeth paused, her hands trembling as she touched something familiar. "It's Jack's briefcase, his favorite, the one he always took to important meetings." Carefully, she extracted the worn leather briefcase. The zipper was protected by a small padlock with a peculiar design. "The charm," Elizabeth whispered, looking at Max's collar. "They're not coordinates. It's a key." Indeed, when she brought the charm close to the padlock, it fit perfectly. With a soft click, the briefcase opened. Inside, they found more documents, a notebook, and surprisingly, an old cell phone. Elizabeth recognized it immediately. It was Jack's personal phone, the one he used to record the meetings. "It's discharged," Johnson noted, examining the device. "But if we can turn it on..." A noise of approaching footsteps interrupted them. This time they sounded closer, more determined. "Quickly," Johnson urged, helping Elizabeth store everything in her bag. "We have to keep moving." But Max had other plans. Instead of guiding them towards another exit, the dog stood firm in his position, his eyes fixed on the chamber's entrance. "Max," Elizabeth whispered, concerned about his behavior. The footsteps stopped just outside the chamber. A figure was silhouetted against the dim light of the tunnel, and a familiar voice broke the silence. "I knew I'd find you here, Elizabeth." Elizabeth's blood froze in her veins. It wasn't Richard's voice, nor that of any of their pursuers. It was a voice she hadn't heard in 5 years, a voice she believed lost forever. Max took a step forward, his tail moving for the first time since their escape began, as the figure emerged from the shadows, revealing a face that, although gaunt and aged, Elizabeth could never forget. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of running water in the tunnels. What Elizabeth didn't know was that this encounter, far from being the end of her search, was barely the beginning of a truth much more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined. Elizabeth remained motionless, her mind struggling to process the image before her. Jack had changed. His face was thinner, with an unkempt beard and deep dark circles that spoke of years of life in the shadows. But his eyes were still the same, with that mixture of determination and melancholy that she remembered so well. "You've been alive all this time," Elizabeth whispered, her voice trembling between disbelief and indignation. "You made us believe that." "We had no other choice," Jack interrupted, taking a step forward. Max moved between them, his behavior evidencing a divided loyalty. "The information I discovered, it was too dangerous. I needed to protect you." Detective Johnson kept one hand near his weapon, assessing the situation. "Why appear now, Thompson? Why send the dog back?" Jack approached one of the old boxes and extracted an ancient flashlight, turning it on to better illuminate the space. The shadows danced on the walls as he began to speak. "Because the deadline is about to expire," he explained, his voice loaded with urgency. "In 3 days, the statute of limitations will protect everyone involved in the Eagle Corporation fraud. All the evidence I gathered, all the sacrifices, everything will have been in vain." "Statute of limitations?" Elizabeth took a step forward. "What are you talking about?" "The biggest corporate fraud in the history of New York," Jack responded, taking out a USB device from his worn jacket. "They didn't just divert funds, Elizabeth. They created a complete system of shell companies to launder money on an international scale. And Richard wasn't just another executive. He was the architect behind it all." Elizabeth felt her legs weaken. Max approached her, offering his silent support. "Is that why you took Max?" she asked, the pieces beginning to fit in her mind. Jack knelt next to the dog, gently stroking his head. "Max was my only companion during the nights I spent recording secret meetings in the Aurora building. He witnessed everything. And when they discovered I had evidence, they chased you," Johnson completed. "They tried to silence me," Jack confirmed, "but Max saved me. He kept them at bay long enough for me to escape with the evidence. After that, I knew I couldn't leave him behind. They knew he was a key witness." "A key witness?" Elizabeth frowned. "He's a dog, Jack. A dog that can identify every person present at those meetings," Jack explained. "Why do you think Richard is so insistent on finding him? Max doesn't just recognize their voices, he recognizes their smells, their movements. In a court, his behavior towards certain people would be crucial circumstantial evidence." A distant noise in the tunnels interrupted the conversation. Max went on alert immediately. "We don't have much time," Jack urged. "Richard has people throughout the tunnel network. We must reach the meeting point before dawn." "Meeting point?" Elizabeth asked. "With Aurora Valdez," Jack responded, surprising everyone. "Not the original Aurora, but her daughter. She's been helping me all this time preparing the case from the shadows. She's a federal prosecutor." Elizabeth remembered the name of the building, the connections beginning to take shape in her mind. "That's why the building is called Aurora." "It was a perfect facade," Jack nodded. No one would suspect that the Valdez family's old building was still being used as an operations point for a federal investigation. More noises in the tunnels, this time closer. Max began to growl softly. "They're coming from 2 directions," Johnson warned, drawing his weapon. "There's another exit," Jack indicated, moving a rusty shelf to reveal a hidden passage. "This tunnel connects directly to the old storm drainage system. It will lead us to the safe point." Elizabeth looked at Max, who had already positioned himself next to the entrance of the new tunnel, as if he perfectly understood the plan. "Elizabeth," Jack gently took her arm before she entered the passage. "There's something else you need to know. Something about Richard that I discovered the night I disappeared." A metallic crash resonated in the main tunnel, followed by voices and flashlight beams. "Later," Johnson urged, pushing them towards the secret passage. "Now we have to move." As they delved into the new darkness, Elizabeth couldn't stop thinking about Jack's unfinished words. What else had he discovered about Richard? What other truth could be so terrible as to justify 5 years of silence and separation? The answer, as she would soon discover, was more sinister than she could have ever imagined. The new tunnel was narrower and damper than the previous ones. The sound of running water intensified with each step, mixing with the distant echo of their pursuers. Jack led the group, his familiarity with the subterranean labyrinth evidencing years of use as a refuge. Max stayed close to Elizabeth, alternating glances between her and Jack, as if trying to keep both within his field of protection. Detective Johnson brought up the rear, alert to any sign that they were being caught up to. "The water," Elizabeth pointed out, noticing that the level was gradually increasing on the tunnel floor. "Is this normal?" "We're close to the main collector," Jack explained, his voice mixing with the aquatic rumble. "But there's something you need to know before we continue." He stopped in a small lateral chamber, barely large enough for everyone to enter. The flashlight's beam revealed more symbols on the walls, similar to those on Max's charm. "Richard isn't who everyone thinks he is," Jack began, his voice loaded with urgency. "His arrival in your life wasn't a coincidence, Elizabeth. He's been watching you since the moment I disappeared." Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the tunnel's humidity. "What do you mean?" "The night I discovered the truth about Eagle Corporation," Jack continued, taking out a small notebook from his worn jacket, "I found something else. Documents that connected Richard to another organization, one that specialized in making evidence and people disappear." Max emitted a low growl, as if Jack's words had activated some disturbing memory. "Richard approached you with a purpose," Jack went on. "They needed to know if I had left any evidence, if I had confided any information to you. Your pain over my disappearance. He used it to gain your trust." Elizabeth leaned against the damp wall, feeling the world spinning around her. All of Richard's attentions, his seemingly infinite understanding when she kept searching for answers about Jack, his insistence on selling the Aurora building, everything took on a new and terrible meaning. "But there's more." Jack lowered his voice, looking directly at Elizabeth. "The night I disappeared, Max and I discovered them in a secret meeting in the basement of the Aurora building. They were planning something big, something that involved abandoned properties all over the city. Richard mentioned something about total cleanup. The tunnels," Johnson intervened, connecting the dots. "That's why they know this underground system so well. They've been using it." A muffled bark from Max interrupted the conversation. The dog was staring fixedly into the darkness of the tunnel, his ears erect in alert. "They're getting closer," Johnson whispered. "There's something you need to see first," Jack insisted, guiding them towards a rusty door almost invisible in the tunnel wall. "The real reason why Richard is so desperate to find us?" The door opened with a metallic screech, revealing a small improvised office. The walls were covered with photographs and documents, similar to the hideout in the Aurora building, but there was something different here. Something more sinister. "Look," Jack pointed to a series of recent photographs. "Richard isn't just looking for me or Max. He's looking for this." Elizabeth approached the images and felt her heart stop. They were photographs of construction works, all on properties that Richard had acquired through Eagle Corporation. But what caught her attention were the marks on the blueprints, exact locations of tunnels and underground chambers, many of them connected to the system they were using. "I don't understand," Elizabeth murmured. "What does all this mean?" "It means," Jack replied, his voice grave, "that the financial fraud was just the surface. Richard and his organization have been using these tunnels for something much bigger, and in 3 days, when the statute of limitations expires, they plan to seal it all. Literally." A distant crash made Max go on alert again. The sound of water seemed louder now, more threatening. "We have to move," Johnson urged. "If they find us here." But before he could finish his sentence, a metallic noise resonated throughout the tunnel, followed by the unmistakable sound of floodgates opening. "No," Jack whispered, his face paling. "They've opened the main collector's floodgates." The water level in the tunnel began to rise rapidly. "They want to trap us down here," Johnson shouted as water began to enter the small office. Max barked urgently, pulling on Elizabeth's sleeve towards a specific direction. On his collar, the charm glowed more intensely than ever, like a compass in the growing darkness. What none of them knew was that on the surface, Richard had just received a call that would dramatically change the course of events. A call from someone who knew all the secrets of the tunnels, someone who had been watching from the shadows all this time. The icy water was already knee-deep when Max guided them towards an elevated passage they hadn't noticed before. The dog moved with determination, as if each step was part of a previously rehearsed route. "Hurry," Jack urged, helping Elizabeth climb up a rusty metal ladder. "This level connects to the old underground warehouses of the commercial district." Detective Johnson covered the rear, his flashlight revealing that the water continued to rise at an alarming rate. The roar of liquid filling the tunnels created a deafening echo that bounced off the concrete walls. "Wait," Elizabeth exclaimed, stopping abruptly. "The documents, they were left in the office." "No time," Jack responded, taking her by the arm. "I have copies of everything in a safe place. Aurora has the originals." They advanced through the new tunnel, which fortunately was several meters above the flood level. Max occasionally stopped at intersections, his nose working intensely before choosing a direction. "The charm," Elizabeth noticed between gasps. "It glows more intensely when Max chooses a path. How is that possible?" "Special phosphorescent paint," Jack explained as they ran. "It reacts with moisture. I marked all the safe routes with invisible symbols that only activate when there are changes in water levels. Max learned to recognize them during our months down here." A metallic crash resonated in the distance, followed by the sound of voices and hurried footsteps. "We're not the only ones who know these elevated routes," Johnson warned, checking his weapon. Suddenly, Max stopped dead in his tracks, growling towards a shadow moving ahead. A figure emerged from the darkness, and Elizabeth stifled a cry of surprise. "Welcome," said a middle-aged woman, her elegant posture contrasting with the deteriorated surroundings. "I've been expecting you." "Aurora," Jack sighed with evident relief. "Thank God." "Aurora Valdez?" Elizabeth asked, recognizing in her some features from the photos she had seen in the Aurora building. "The same," the woman responded, as she took out a small electronic tablet from her bag. "And you arrived just in time." Richard just made his last mistake. On the tablet screen, a real-time video was playing. It showed Richard in what appeared to be a control center, giving explicit orders to flood the tunnels. "We've got him," Aurora smiled. "Attempted destruction of evidence and something more serious, but we must move. There's something you need to see before it's too late." Max barked softly, recognizing Aurora. She bent down to pet him briefly. "Good job, friend," she whispered to the dog. "You fulfilled your mission perfectly." "My mission?" Elizabeth intervened. "What's really going on here?" Aurora shared a significant look with Jack before responding. "His return wasn't a coincidence, Elizabeth," she explained. "Max appeared in your garden exactly when he was supposed to, when we finally had all the necessary evidence, and when we discovered Richard's true plan." The sound of rising water and approaching voices grew more intense. "There's no time for complete explanations," Aurora urged. "Follow me. What you're about to see will answer all your questions and reveal why Richard is willing to do anything to stop us." As they followed Aurora through a new set of tunnels, Elizabeth noticed that these were better maintained, with more elaborate phosphorescent markings on the walls. Max now walked with more confidence, as if he recognized this territory. "For 5 years," Aurora continued as they advanced, "we've been documenting every move of Richard and his organization. But 3 months ago, we discovered something that changed everything. Something that explains why they bought so many abandoned properties, why they needed the tunnels." She stopped in front of a modern steel door, totally out of place in the ancient surroundings. Max sat in front of it, as if he had reached his final destination. "Prepare yourselves," Aurora warned as she entered a code into the electronic panel. "What you're about to see is the real reason why Jack had to disappear. The reason why Richard married you, Elizabeth. And the reason why these tunnels are just the tip of the iceberg of a much larger operation." The door opened with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a modern control room filled with monitors and surveillance equipment. On the screens, dozens of cameras showed different sections of the tunnels and, more disturbingly, the interior of several seemingly abandoned buildings. But it was what the central monitor showed that made Elizabeth bring her hands to her mouth, while Max emitted a low growl and Johnson cursed under his breath. The truth they were about to discover would forever change not only their lives, but the very history of the city. On the central screens, a 3-dimensional map of the city was displayed, but it wasn't an ordinary map. Layers upon layers of tunnels and underground structures crisscrossed beneath the streets like an intricate circulatory system, many of them completely unknown to the authorities. "This is impossible," Elizabeth murmured, approaching the monitors. "All of this exists under the city. Most are ancient tunnels," Aurora explained, manipulating the controls to show different levels. "But what Richard and his organization have been doing is connecting and expanding them, creating a city beneath the city." On the secondary screens, cameras showed enormous underground warehouses, some the size of football fields, filled with containers and sophisticated equipment. "They're not just warehouses," Jack pointed out, his voice tense. "They're complete operation centers. They have their own electrical grid, ventilation systems, even living areas." Max approached one of the monitors, growling softly at the image it showed, a space that Elizabeth recognized as similar to where they had found the marks on his paws. "That's where they kept him," Jack confirmed, gently stroking the dog. "When they discovered I had recorded their meetings, they tried to catch both of us. Max helped me escape, but he was injured in the process." "But I don't understand," Elizabeth interrupted, turning to Aurora. "Why? Why so much effort to create this underground network?" Aurora pressed some buttons, and the screens showed financial documents and contracts. "Eagle Corporation was just a facade," she explained. "The real business is down here. They've been buying properties on the surface not for the buildings themselves, but for access to the tunnels. Each abandoned property is a potential entry point to their network. And Richard," Elizabeth began, "is the architect of it all," Jack completed. "Not just of the financial fraud, but of the entire underground operation. That's why he approached you, Elizabeth. He needed control over my family's properties, especially the Aurora building. It's one of the main access points." A sharp beep interrupted the conversation. On one of the monitors, several red lights began to flash. "They've activated more floodgates," Aurora warned, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "They're trying to flood complete sections of the system. They want to destroy the evidence," Johnson deduced, observing how water levels rose in several tunnels. "Not just that," Aurora corrected. "They want to make sure no one else can access what's on the deepest level." With a few quick commands, Aurora changed the view to the cameras on the last level. What appeared on the screen left everyone breathless. Huge security vaults, dozens of them, lined up in a space that seemed to extend indefinitely. "The vaults contain documents," Aurora explained, "but not just any kind of documents. They are detailed records of decades of illegal financial operations, not just from Eagle Corporation, but from dozens of important companies and political figures. Insurance," Elizabeth understood. "Richard didn't just create a storage system, he created a control mechanism." "Exactly," Aurora nodded. "Whoever controls these files controls some of the most powerful people in the country. And in 3 days, when the statute of limitations for the original Eagle Corporation case expires, they'll be able to use all this information without fear of legal repercussions," Johnson completed. Max suddenly barked, drawing attention to another monitor. The cameras showed groups of armed men converging on their location. "Richard is on his way," Aurora announced, checking her phone. "And he's not alone. He's bringing some of the most powerful men in the city with him, people who have a lot to lose if this comes to light." "What's the plan?" Johnson asked, preparing his weapon. Aurora smiled, a gesture that contained years of patient planning. "The plan, Detective, is to let them in," she replied, as she pressed a series of buttons on the control panel. "Because what they don't know is that every step they take, every word they say is being transmitted live to the federal authorities." At that moment, Max approached Elizabeth, the charm on his collar glowing more intensely than ever. And it was then that Elizabeth noticed something she had overlooked: tiny cameras, almost invisible, installed on the dog's collar. Max wasn't just a witness, she finally understood. He was an undercover agent all this time. Aurora nodded. "The most loyal companion and the most discreet spy we could have had. And now he's about to complete his final mission." The lights in the control room flickered, and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the tunnels. The final confrontation was about to begin. Aurora typed commands rapidly on the control panel, while the screens showed Richard and his group approaching through different tunnels. Max remained alert next to Elizabeth, his posture tense but controlled. "Everyone in position," Aurora ordered, activating a hidden communication system. "Federal team on standby. Let them reach the designated point." Elizabeth watched the screens with a mixture of fascination and horror. Richard, dressed in an impeccable suit despite the underground environment, led a group of men she recognized from social events and business magazine covers. "They're all members of the Eagle Corporation Board," Jack murmured, pointing to the figures on the monitors. "The same ones who appeared in my recordings 5 years ago." Detective Johnson strategically positioned himself near the entrance, while Jack and Elizabeth remained by the main controls. Max, surprisingly, sat in the center of the room, as if he were waiting for something. 30 seconds, Aurora announced, her eyes fixed on a digital timer. The sound of footsteps and voices became clearer. Elizabeth could distinguish Richard's voice giving orders, his usual confident executive tone mixed with an urgency she had never heard from him before. "Elizabeth," Jack whispered, briefly taking her hand. "Whatever happens, remember that everything I did was to protect me," she completed, squeezing his hand. "I know. I understand now." The doors of the control center burst open. Richard entered first, followed by 4 suited men. Their faces showed a mixture of surprise and fury at finding the room occupied. "Elizabeth," Richard's voice sounded controlled, but his eyes betrayed his nervousness. "Get away from him. You don't know what Jack has done." "On the contrary, Richard," Elizabeth responded, her voice firm. "I finally know exactly what everyone has done." Max slowly stood up, his presence capturing everyone's attention. Richard visibly paled upon seeing the dog's collar glowing in the artificial light. "That collar," one of the businessmen muttered, taking a step back. "All this time, 5 years of constant surveillance," Aurora confirmed, activating a series of screens that showed hundreds of hours of recordings. Every meeting, every transaction, every conversation in the tunnels. "Max has been our eyes and ears all this time." "Who are you?" Richard demanded, though the tremor in his voice suggested he already knew. "Aurora Valdez, Special Federal Prosecutor," she responded, showing her badge. "And you gentlemen are all under arrest." Richard let out a nervous laugh. "Under arrest? With what evidence? In 3 days, everything expires." "Eagle Corporation's financial operations expire," Aurora corrected. "But the extortion system you've been building down here, that's an ongoing crime. And we have it all documented." As if to confirm her words, Max approached Richard, and the small cameras on his collar transmitted the businessman's panic-stricken expression live to all the screens in the room. "It's impossible," one of Richard's companions whispered. "No one could have planned something like this," Jack completed. "Use a dog as an undercover agent?" "That's precisely why it worked. Who would suspect a simple German shepherd?" Richard took a step towards Elizabeth, his facade of control crumbling. "Everything I did for us. The power, the influence we could have." "You did it for yourself," Elizabeth interrupted, stepping back. "You used me to get to Jack's properties, to complete your underground network." Max growled softly, placing himself between Elizabeth and Richard. On his collar, the lights blinked in a specific pattern. "Signal received," Aurora announced, pressing a final button. "Federal team, proceed." The lights of the control center flickered again, and sounds of movement resonated in the surrounding tunnels. The businessmen looked nervously around, aware that they were trapped. "It's over, Richard," Elizabeth declared, her voice mixing sadness and determination. "The dog you thought insignificant just brought down your underground empire." Max barked once, as if in agreement, while federal agents began to enter the room. The expression on Richard's face as he saw his empire crumbling was a mixture of disbelief and defeat. But as the agents proceeded with the arrests, no one noticed the small smile that formed on Richard's lips, nor the device he discreetly pressed in his pocket. An almost imperceptible beep began to sound in the depths of the tunnels, initiating a countdown that would change the course of everything. Max was the first to detect that something was wrong. His ears moved sharply, and he began to bark towards the security monitors, where small red lights were starting to blink in different sectors of the underground map. Aurora quickly turned to the controls, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "The containment floodgates, they're closing automatically." "Not just the floodgates," Jack added, pointing to other indicators on the screens. "The ventilation systems are sealing off. It's a total containment protocol." Richard, still handcuffed, let out a soft laugh that chilled Elizabeth's blood. "Did you really think I wouldn't have a contingency plan? If we fall, everything falls with us." "Data deletion process detected," alerted one of the federal technicians who had just arrived. The servers are beginning a systematic elimination process. Aurora typed frantically, trying to stop the emergency protocols. They've activated some kind of self-destruct system. They're erasing everything and sealing the facilities. Not just erasing, Richard corrected, his voice loaded with a disturbing calm. In exactly 15 minutes, every document, every record, every piece of evidence in these vaults will be destroyed. And with the tunnel system sealed, no one will be able to stop it. Max began to move restlessly around the room, his behavior catching Elizabeth's attention. The dog stopped at certain points, sniffing intensely, as if he sensed something the others couldn't detect. "He's looking for something," Elizabeth murmured, observing Max's movement pattern. "Aurora, are there more levels below this control center?" "Not according to the plans," Aurora responded, without stopping her work on the controls. "But given the secrets we've uncovered," as if responding to an invisible signal, Max stopped in front of an apparently solid section of the wall, scratching the floor insistently. The charm on his collar glowed with unusual intensity. "Jack," Elizabeth called, "do you remember if there was any special mark on the original building plans for this area?" "The original plans?" Jack stopped abruptly, his eyes opening with realization. "The mirror plan. Each main level had a mirror level, hidden. It was part of the Valdez's original design." Aurora quickly joined them, examining the wall where Max continued to indicate, "Of course. My mother always said that the building's true secrets were in its reflections." Detective Johnson approached with a powerful flashlight, illuminating the wall section. Under the intense light, almost invisible patterns began to reveal themselves. Symbols similar to those on Max's collar, but older, more elaborate. "They're Valdez family marks," Aurora explained, running her fingers over the symbols. Each important building had its own set of security symbols, like an architectural signature. "But how does Max know them?" Elizabeth asked. "Because I taught them to him," Jack responded. "During our months in hiding, I used the original symbols as a basis for our own navigation system. Max learned to recognize them all." A new set of alarms began to sound above. "4 minutes," someone shouted. "The destruction systems are accelerating." "We won't make it in time," Jack murmured, observing the levels and levels of documents that needed to be protected. But Max had other plans. The dog positioned himself in the exact center of the room, and for the first time since Elizabeth had known him, emitted a long and sustained bark at a frequency that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. The ancient lights in the room began to turn on one by one, revealing a system of mirrors and reflectors that no one had noticed. Max's collar, responding to the bark, projected its light towards the first mirror, initiating a chain reaction. "It's a mass activation system," Aurora understood, watching in awe as each level of the library lit up. "Max doesn't just know the entrance, he knows how to activate the original protection protocols." The floor began to vibrate gently, and sounds of ancient machinery coming to life filled the room. Each shelf, each document, began to be protected by glass barriers similar to the central cylinder. 3 minutes, someone announced, but now there was a tone of hope in their voice. Elizabeth observed Max, who maintained his position in the center of the room, his bark modulating in frequency and intensity as he directed the protection process. At that moment, she understood why Jack had trusted him so much during all these years. What no one knew was that, on the upper level, Richard had managed to free himself from his handcuffs and, in the chaos of the alarms and evacuation, was heading towards them with one last card up his sleeve, one that threatened to destroy not just the documents, but the entire Valdez legacy once and for all. The protection system continued to activate level by level, while Max maintained his central position, modulating his bark with almost supernatural precision. The ancient mirrors reflected the light from his collar, creating a protection network that expanded throughout the entire library. 2 minutes and 30 seconds, one of the technicians shouted from the entrance. Aurora worked frantically on the ancient control panel, her fingers moving with the familiarity of someone who has grown up with these secrets. "The system is responding, but we need more time. The protection must be completed on all levels." A sudden crash from the access tunnel made everyone turn. Richard's voice resonated off the ancient walls. "You can't stop it. Everything is programmed to be destroyed." "Johnson," Aurora shouted, "don't let him get near the center of the room." The detective and several agents positioned themselves at the entrance, but Richard had already appeared in the doorway. His perfect suit was now disheveled, and his eyes gleamed with a feverish determination. "Ah, the original Valdez vault," he smiled, observing the room with a mixture of admiration and contempt. "The heart of the entire system. I should have imagined something like this existed." Max momentarily interrupted his barking, turning towards Richard with a threatening growl. The protection process visibly slowed down. "Don't come any closer," Elizabeth warned, noticing that Richard was holding something in his right hand. "Or what, dear?" he responded, showing a small black device. "Your dog will stop me? One button, and the entire electrical system will overload. Not even these ancient protections will survive that." "2 minutes," someone announced. Jack stepped forward. "Richard, you don't understand what you're doing. These documents don't just contain corporate secrets. They're part of the city's history." "History is for the weak," Richard exclaimed, his facade of control breaking for the first time. "I built something bigger, something that would give us real power." "No," Aurora intervened, without stopping her work on the panel. "You built a prison. Every tunnel, every modern vault you created was a cell to store secrets you would use as blackmail." Max resumed his barking, and another section of the library began to seal. Richard took a step forward, but stopped when several agents raised their weapons. 1 minute and 30 seconds, the technician reminded. "Look around you," Richard continued, pointing to the shelves that rose into the darkness. "All this power, all this control, wasted by generations of Valdez. I gave it a purpose." "You gave it a price," Elizabeth corrected. "You turned secrets into merchandise." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "And what about your dear Jack? Do you think he's so different? He hid for 5 years playing spy with a dog, while others did the real work." 1 minute, the technician's voice sounded tense. Max modulated his bark to a higher frequency, and the mirrors began to spin more rapidly, accelerating the protection process. Richard raised the device. "It's over," he declared. "If I can't have control of these secrets, no one will." But before he could press the button, something extraordinary happened. Max's collar emitted a blinding flash, and all the mirrors in the room aligned simultaneously, creating a light pattern that converged exactly on the spot where Richard was standing. "The original defense system," Aurora whispered in awe. Max activated it. Richard found himself trapped in a circle of light, unable to move. The device fell from his paralyzed hand. 30 seconds, the technician announced. "Now, Max," Jack shouted. "The final protocol." The dog emitted a series of barks in rapid succession, each at a different frequency. The mirrors responded, spinning in increasingly complex patterns, completing the protection of each level in seconds. 15 seconds, 10, 5. A final bark from Max, more powerful than all the previous ones, resonated in the room. All the glass barriers sealed simultaneously with a crystalline sound, just as the counter reached 0. On the upper level, the explosions and destruction programmed by Richard began, but in the ancient vault, protected by technology he had never understood, the documents remained intact. Richard, still trapped in the circle of light, watched helplessly as his empire crumbled, not by the brute force of the law, but by the loyalty of a dog and the wisdom of generations guarded in ancient symbols. But as the agents moved to arrest him again, no one noticed that a barely perceptible smile was forming on his lips, because even in his defeat, Richard held one last secret, one that not even Max had discovered yet. The dust was slowly settling in the underground library as the agents handcuffed Richard again. Max, exhausted from the effort of activating the ancient protocols, had lain down next to Elizabeth, who was gently stroking his fur. "I need to check the damage on the upper level," Aurora announced, heading towards the entrance. The explosions may have compromised the structure, but when she tried to open the bronze door, it didn't respond. The symbols on the walls began to glow with a reddish light. "Something's not right," Jack murmured, approaching the control panel. "The system is detecting some kind of external threat." Richard, still held by 2 agents, let out a soft laugh. "Did you really think that was my only plan? Modern systems aren't the only ones that can be modified." Max suddenly stood up, his nose working intensely as he sniffed the air. A low sound, almost imperceptible, began to resonate in the walls. "It's a subsonic frequency," one of the technicians explained, consulting a portable device. "It's interfering with the ancient mechanisms. Impossible, Aurora protested. The Valdez systems are immune to modern electronic interference, but not to mechanical, Richard smiled. I spent years studying the original building plans. Every frequency, every resonance, even Max's barks. Everything can be replicated and distorted. As if confirming his words, the mirrors began to vibrate subtly, their angles changing millimeter by millimeter. The glass barriers protecting the documents emitted an unsettling hum. He's using the place's natural resonance against us, Jack realized. If the frequency reaches the critical point, the entire protection system will collapse, Aurora completed, her fingers flying over the ancient panel. And this time there will be no way to stop it. Max began to move restlessly around the room, stopping at different points, as if searching for something. His collar glowed erratically, affected by the invasive frequencies. Elizabeth, Jack called urgently. Do you remember when Max appeared in your garden? Did you notice anything unusual about his behavior? Elizabeth closed her eyes, trying to remember. He was scratching the ground, like he does when he finds something important, but he also seemed to be listening to something. That's it, Aurora exclaimed. He wasn't just following the plan to find you. He was calibrating his hearing to the correct frequencies. The low sound intensified, and some of the glass barriers began to show tiny cracks. Richard watched everything with barely contained satisfaction. Each of Max's barks has a specific frequency, Aurora continued. Not just to activate the mechanisms, but to keep them stable. It's a continuous calibration system. But now he's exhausted, Johnson pointed out, observing how the dog was visibly panting. He can't maintain the effort for much longer. Elizabeth knelt next to Max, noticing something on his collar that she hadn't seen before. Small marks around the charm like notches on a dial. They're not wear marks, she murmured, examining them more closely. They're adjustments like a musical score. The original frequencies, Aurora whispered, approaching to see. My mother always said that the city's true music was in its foundations. Max suddenly raised his head, his ears moving with precision. With a visible effort, he stood up and began to bark in a new pattern, different from all the previous ones. He's countering the invasive frequencies, the technician explained, monitoring the levels. But he needs more power. The mirrors, Jack pointed out, they don't just reflect light, they also amplify sound. Aurora ran to the control panel. If we can synchronize the mirrors with Max's barks... But Richard interrupted with a laugh. Too late. The resonance is already at critical levels. In less than 5 minutes, the entire system will collapse. Elizabeth, however, had noticed something else, a sequence of numbers engraved on the inside of Max's collar, almost invisible under years of wear. They're not numbers, she suddenly realized. They're coordinates for the mirrors. Max doesn't just know the correct frequencies, he knows exactly how the reflectors should be aligned. The dog, as if confirming her discovery, began to move in a specific pattern around the room, his collar projecting light onto particular mirrors at precise moments. What no one knew was that this seemingly random dance was, in fact, the key to deactivating not only the current threat, but to revealing an even deeper level of secrets that not even Richard knew about. Secrets that would forever change everyone's understanding of the tunnel's true purpose. Max's dance through the underground library became more precise with each step. His collar projected flashes of light that, when reflected off the correctly aligned mirrors, created increasingly complex geometric patterns on the walls. The cracks in the barriers are stabilizing, the technician reported, monitoring the resonance levels. But the invasive frequency is still increasing. Richard, still held by the agents but with an unsettling smile, observed the scene with growing interest. Interesting. The dog knows the complete choreography. I wonder, does he also know the ending? Aurora worked frantically on the control panel, trying to decipher the patterns Max was creating. These aren't just random movements. He's recreating something, a specific sequence. Elizabeth, following Max's movements, noticed that the dog briefly stopped at certain points in the room, as if marking vertices of an invisible figure. At each pause, his bark subtly changed in tone. The numbers on his collar, she murmured, taking out the small notebook they had found in Jack's briefcase. They're not just coordinates for the mirrors, they're musical notes. Jack quickly approached. Musical notes. Look, Elizabeth pointed, showing a page in the notebook where Jack had drawn what appeared to be musical staffs next to the ancient symbols. You were transcribing the frequencies to musical notation. Of course, Aurora breathed, a realization illuminating her face. My mother always said that the true protection wasn't in the locks, but in the city's music. Each important building had its own security melody. The low sound of the invasive frequencies increased, making the walls vibrate more intensely. Some of the cracks in the glass barriers began to expand again. 3 minutes before total collapse, the technician warned. Max, however, seemed more energized than ever. His barks, though tired, maintained perfect musical precision as he continued his journey around the room. He's composing, Elizabeth understood. Each bark, each position, is part of a larger score. Not composing, Richard corrected, his smile fading for the first time. He's remembering. The original Valdez melody. Aurora turned to him sharply. How do you know about the melody? Why do you think I spent years studying the original plans? Richard responded. I knew there was something more, something the Valdez had hidden in the very structure of their buildings, a master key. Max completed another circuit of the room, and the light patterns on the walls began to converge on a specific point, the exact center of the vaulted ceiling. It's a resonator, Jack exclaimed. The entire room is designed as a giant musical instrument. The cracks in the glass barriers stopped expanding, as if the very structure of the place was responding to Max's melody. The mirrors, now perfectly aligned, amplified each bark, creating a symphony of light and sound that filled the space. 2 minutes, the technician announced, though his voice sounded less urgent. Max stopped in the center of the room, exactly where he had been when he activated the initial protections. His collar glowed with a blinding intensity, and the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse to the rhythm of his barks. It's working, Aurora whispered, observing how the resonance levels began to stabilize. But Richard let out a soft laugh. Do you really think it's that simple? The original Valdez melody wasn't just a protection system. It was a key that opened something much more valuable than mere documents. As if responding to his words, the floor beneath their feet began to vibrate in a different way. It wasn't the destructive vibration from before, but something more rhythmic, more controlled. Max emitted a series of barks in a specific sequence, and the center of the floor began to slowly open, revealing a descending spiral that was lost in the darkness. The city's true heart, Aurora murmured, recognizing ancient symbols on the appearing steps. The Founder's secret archive. Elizabeth observed Max, who now looked at the newly revealed staircase with a mixture of determination and weariness. The dog had completed part of his mission, but something in his posture suggested that the real test was just beginning. What no one suspected was that in the depths of this new level, a truth awaited that would connect not only the past with the present, but would reveal the true purpose of the entire underground network. A truth that not even Richard, with all his years of research, had managed to discover. The spiral staircase descended into darkness, its polished stone steps glowing faintly under the light from Max's collar. The dog led the group, each step cautious but determined, as Elizabeth, Jack, Aurora, and 2 agents escorting Richard followed his descent. The resonance levels have stabilized upstairs, the technician reported through Aurora's radio. The rest of the team is securing the protected documents. The air grew denser and more ancient as they descended, charged with the weight of centuries of secrets. The walls of the staircase were covered with inscriptions that seemed to change and move under the fluctuating light. They're records, Aurora murmured, running her fingers over the marks. Each level tells a part of the city's history, but not as we know it. Richard, though handcuffed, observed every detail with academic intensity. The true history, isn't it? The one the books never told. Max stopped abruptly on a landing, his collar projecting a complex pattern onto a specific section of the wall. The inscriptions began to glow with their own light, revealing images that seemed to come to life. It's a map, Elizabeth whispered, watching in awe as the luminous lines formed a 3-dimensional plan of the city. But it's different. It shows structures that don't exist on the surface. Or that no longer exist, Jack corrected. Look at the dates in the margins. These plans are from the very foundation of the city. Aurora moved closer to the glowing map. The tunnels we know, they're just a small part. The original network was much more extensive, and it had a specific purpose. Preservation, Richard completed, his voice mixing admiration and frustration. The founders didn't just build a city, they created a living archive, a way to protect knowledge through the centuries. Max barked softly, drawing attention to another section of the wall where new images were forming. They showed a series of interconnected chambers, each dedicated to a different aspect of knowledge: science, art, history, technology. "My family," Aurora explained, her voice loaded with emotion. "The Valdez weren't just builders or architects. They were guardians. Each generation had the responsibility to protect and preserve the knowledge that others wanted to destroy or hide." "And you turned it into an extortion system," Elizabeth accused, looking at Richard. But Richard shook his head, an enigmatic smile on his lips. "No, dear. I was trying to access something much more valuable than mere corporate secrets. The real treasure is further down." As if confirming his words, Max began to descend again, this time with more urgency. The collar now projected a more intense light, and the symbols on the wall seemed to respond to his presence, illuminating the path. After what seemed like an eternity, they arrived at a massive circular chamber. The vaulted ceiling was lost in darkness, and the walls were covered with what appeared to be screens of ancient crystal, each showing different types of information in diverse languages and symbols. "The central library," Aurora breathed. "The core of the entire system." In the center of the chamber, on a raised platform, stood a pedestal with what appeared to be an ancient book. Max headed directly towards it, his collar glowing with blinding intensity. "The Founder's Codex," Richard murmured, his voice trembling for the first time. "The key to understanding the entire system." But when Max reached the pedestal, something unexpected happened. Instead of stopping, the dog began to bark in a specific sequence, and the book began to glow, projecting ancient holograms that filled the chamber. "It's not a book," Elizabeth understood. "It's an interface." The holographic images showed the true nature of the underground network. It wasn't just a system of tunnels and archives, but a living machine designed to protect and preserve humanity's knowledge through the ages. That's why they needed Max, Jack realized. Not just for his ability to navigate the tunnels or activate mechanisms. They needed him because only a living being with the correct frequencies can activate the complete system, Aurora completed, observing how the holograms responded to each of Max's barks. Richard took a step forward, his eyes shining with a mixture of triumph and revelation. "And now that the system is active..." But before he could complete the phrase, Max emitted a different bark, more powerful than all the previous ones. The holograms froze, and a new set of symbols began to appear on the walls. It was a warning, Elizabeth understood. A warning that not even Richard, with all his research, had anticipated. The symbols on the walls pulsed with a reddish light, while Max maintained his position in front of the pedestal, his sustained bark resonating at increasingly deeper frequencies. The holograms filling the chamber began to show a sequence of images that chilled the blood of all present. "It can't be," Aurora whispered, translating the ancient symbols. "The system... it's predicting a collapse." "Collapse?" Elizabeth asked, observing how the holographic images showed a simulation of the modern city superimposed over the ancient tunnels. "The Founders," Aurora explained, her voice trembling, "didn't just build this system to preserve knowledge, they designed it to protect the city itself. The tunnels are part of a seismic and structural monitoring network." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "You finally understand. Why do you think I invested so much in buying specific properties? Each building I acquired is above a crucial node of the ancient network." Jack approached one of the holographic panels, studying the data that was unfolding. The vibrations from modern constructions, the weight of new buildings, everything is creating pressure on the ancient tunnels. "And my modifications to the system," Richard added, his voice mixing pride and concern, "accelerated the process. Each attempt to access the ancient secrets weakened the structure more." Max barked again, and the holograms showed a temporal projection. In less than 48 hours, complete sectors of the ancient tunnels would begin to collapse, putting at risk not only the historical archives, but the very stability of the modern city. "That's why you came back now," Elizabeth understood, looking at Max. "Not just for the Eagle Corporation documents or the corporate secrets. You came to warn us." Aurora worked frantically on one of the ancient crystal panels. "The original system had emergency protocols for situations like this, but we need..." "The correct sequence," Richard completed. The exact combination of frequencies and resonances to activate the stabilization protocols. Max moved towards the exact center of the chamber, his collar glowing with a pattern Elizabeth hadn't seen before. The symbols on the collar began to align with specific marks on the floor. "It's a master resonator," Aurora explained. "The entire chamber is designed to amplify and direct the correct frequencies through the tunnel network." "But Max is exhausted," Elizabeth pointed out, noticing how the dog was visibly panting. "He can't maintain the necessary frequencies for much longer." Richard, surprisingly, took a step forward. "There's a way. The original plans showed an emergency amplification system. If we can activate it." "Why would you help us?" Jack questioned with distrust. "Because I understood too late the true purpose of all this," Richard responded, his previous arrogance replaced by genuine gravity. "It's not about power or control. It's about preservation." Aurora consulted the ancient symbols. "The amplification system, it needs multiple simultaneous activation points. Like an orchestra, each frequency must be perfectly synchronized." Max barked softly, as if confirming the information, and began to move in a circular pattern. His collar now projected specific points of light in different sections of the chamber. "He's marking the positions," Elizabeth realized. "The points where we need to be for the system to work." "But we need the exact frequencies," Jack added, "and only Max knows them." The dog stopped, looking directly at Elizabeth. On his collar, the symbols began to rearrange themselves, forming a sequence that she recognized from the documents found in Jack's briefcase. "The musical notes," she whispered. "They're not just for opening doors or activating mechanisms. They're part of a larger symphony." "The Founder's Symphony," Aurora confirmed, "a composition designed to maintain the stability of the entire system." The holograms showed the remaining time, less than 47 hours before the collapse would begin. Max took his position in the center of the chamber, ready to guide what would be the most important effort of his life. What none of them knew was that on the surface, unexpected events were about to dramatically complicate their mission. Time was running out, and the true test was just beginning. The underground chamber vibrated with contained energy as Max directed each person to their specific position. The holograms floated in the air, showing a three-dimensional map of the entire tunnel network with critical points flashing in red. 46 hours, Aurora announced, consulting the projected data. Each point marked by Max corresponds to a different resonance node. Elizabeth watched in amazement as Max's collar now projected individual musical sequences for each person. The notes glowed in the air, forming luminous staffs. "They're personalized scores," Jack explained, studying the symbols. "Each position requires a specific frequency to stabilize a different section of the system." Richard, still handcuffed but more cooperative, nodded. "The founders designed this like an underground orchestra. Each note, each vibration contributes to the stability of the whole." Max barked softly, calling everyone's attention. His collar projected a more complex image, a master score that connected all the individual sequences. "He's like a conductor," Elizabeth murmured, watching how Max moved between the positions, adjusting the projection of each score. Aurora worked on the ancient control panel, preparing the amplification system. "We need perfect synchronization. An error in the sequence could accelerate the collapse instead of preventing it." "But how will we produce the exact frequencies?" one of the agents asked, looking at the complex musical notations. In response, Max headed towards a section of the wall that no one had noticed before. His collar illuminated a series of ancient crystals embedded in the stone. "Crystalline resonators," Aurora breathed in awe. Of course, the founders knew that human voices could be imperfect. These crystals are designed to amplify and purify the basic frequencies. "Each crystal must be activated at the precise moment," Richard added. "That's why my previous attempts to access the system failed. I tried to force the frequencies artificially, without understanding the need for natural synchronization." Max returned to the center of the chamber and emitted a series of barks in different tones. The crystals in the walls began to vibrate softly, responding to his frequencies. "He's calibrating the system," Jack explained, "preparing it for the complete sequence." Elizabeth noticed something else in the projections, small time marks next to each note. "It's not just the correct frequency," she realized. "It's also the exact moment, like a universal metronome." The entire city is the instrument, Aurora nodded, and these tunnels are its taut strings. Each vibration resonates through the entire structure. Max began to move in a more complex pattern, his collar glowing with variable intensity as he guided each person through their specific sequence. The crystals responded to each movement, creating a network of light and sound that filled the chamber. 45 hours, Aurora reminded. We need at least 12 hours of continuous synchronization for the system to stabilize completely. Richard, observing the patterns forming, let out a sigh of understanding. All this time, I sought power in the secrets these tunnels held, without understanding that the true power was in their original purpose, the protection of the city itself. A gentle tremor shook the chamber, causing the holograms to fluctuate momentarily. On the maps, more points began to flash red. It's accelerating, Aurora warned. The pressure at the critical points is increasing faster than anticipated. Max barked urgently, and the crystals in the walls started to glow more intensely. It was time to begin. Everyone to your positions, Aurora ordered. Max will guide us through the sequence. Focus on your individual scores and trust the system. As everyone took their places, Elizabeth noticed something extraordinary. Max's collar wasn't just projecting light, but seemed to be absorbing the vibrations from the environment, like a conductor collecting energy from his orchestra. What no one knew was that on the surface, the first signs of the impending disaster were beginning to manifest. Small cracks appeared in the streets, and the city's seismic instruments were registering inexplicable anomalies. The race against time had begun, and success depended not only on technical precision, but on something deeper, the ability to work in perfect harmony, guided by a dog that understood better than anyone the delicate balance between the ancient and modern worlds. The first notes of the Founder's Symphony resonated through the ancient crystals as Max coordinated the sequence from the center of the chamber. Each person in their designated position followed their individual score, creating a complex network of frequencies that interwove in the air. Resonance levels are stabilizing in the northern sector, Aurora reported, monitoring the holograms. But the eastern sector shows signs of increasing tension. Max's collar glowed with variable intensity, automatically adjusting the score projections according to the system's needs. Elizabeth, from her position, noticed how the crystals near her subtly changed color with each correct frequency. It's as if the city is breathing, she whispered, feeling the vibrations under her feet. Each note is a heartbeat. Jack, concentrated on his own sequence, nodded. The Founders understood that the city is a living organism. These tunnels are its veins, and the vibrations are its pulse. A new tremor, stronger than the previous ones, shook the chamber. Several points on the holographic map began to flash intense red. Southern sector compromised, Aurora alerted. The pressure is increasing too quickly. Max reacted instantly, modifying the intensity of his bark. The crystals responded, adjusting their frequencies to counteract the growing instability. Richard, from his position, observed with a mixture of awe and remorse. All this time, I tried to dominate the system when I should have learned to listen to it. 44 hours, one of the agents reminded, consulting the holographic counters. The symphony continued, each participant contributing their part to the complex melody that maintained the stability of the tunnels. But Max was beginning to show signs of exhaustion, his breathing more labored with each bark. He won't be able to maintain this rhythm for 12 hours, Elizabeth murmured with concern. Aurora, without stopping monitoring the levels, nodded gravely. We need a long-term solution, something that can maintain stable frequencies even without Max's constant guidance. The crystals, Jack suggested, noticing how some continued vibrating even after the notes faded. They have vibratory memory. If we could program them with the correct patterns. It's possible, Richard unexpectedly intervened. In my research, I discovered that the crystals can maintain specific frequencies for prolonged periods if calibrated correctly. Max barked in confirmation, and his collar projected a new series of symbols in the air. They were different from the musical scores. They looked more like ancient programming codes. Their calibration instructions, Aurora realized, studying the symbols. Max doesn't just know the symphony. He knows how to make the system maintain itself. But before they could implement this new information, a sharp alarm sounded from the upper levels. In the holograms, a new threat became visible. Water leaks were beginning to appear at various points in the tunnel network. The modern drainage system is collapsing, Aurora explained, her fingers flying over the ancient controls. The pressure is forcing connections that shouldn't exist between the new and old tunnels. Max momentarily interrupted his sequence of barks, his eyes fixed on a specific point of the holographic map. His collar projected a warning that made Aurora pale. The water, it's not just threatening to flood the tunnels, she murmured. If it reaches the main crystals before we complete the calibration, the entire stabilization system will fail, Richard completed, understanding the gravity of the situation. Elizabeth observed Max, who maintained his central position despite visible exhaustion. The dog had faithfully guided each step of this mission, and now, when the threat was greater than ever, his determination seemed unshakable. What no one had noticed yet was that Max's collar had begun to emit a new light pattern, almost imperceptible, directed towards a sealed section of the chamber. A section that, according to Valdez legends, contained the Founder's last and most powerful secret. The true test was about to begin, and with it, the revelation of a purpose that transcended even the preservation of the city itself. The light pattern emanating from Max's collar gradually intensified, forming a golden line that extended to the sealed wall. The nearby crystals began to resonate at a different frequency, deeper and more ancient than the previous ones. "Something's changing," Aurora murmured, observing how the symbols in the holograms spontaneously reorganized. "The system is responding to a sequence we didn't know." Elizabeth followed Max's gaze towards the sealed wall, noticing for the first time details on its surface, faint lines forming a pattern similar to a family tree, with the Valdez symbol at its root. "It's not just a family tree," Aurora realized, approaching the wall. "It's a succession map. Each branch represents not just a person, but a part of the knowledge that needed to be preserved." Max emitted a long, sustained bark, at a frequency that made all the crystals in the chamber vibrate simultaneously. The collar projected a three-dimensional image of the tree, revealing hidden layers of information. "The Founders," Aurora explained, her voice trembling with emotion, "didn't just build this system to protect the city. They built it to preserve something more valuable, the connection between past and future." Richard, observing the projection with amazement, added, "Each generation added its own knowledge, its own understanding. They weren't just files or secrets, it was the accumulated wisdom of centuries." A new tremor shook the chamber, stronger than the previous ones. In the holograms, the water leaks were dangerously approaching critical levels. 43 hours, one of the agents reminded. But Max now seemed more energized than ever. His collar shone with a blinding intensity as he headed towards the exact center of the projected pattern. Each step he took activated new resonances in the crystals. "He's accessing the core of the system," Jack understood. All this time, the collar wasn't just a key or an instrument, it was a living interface. Elizabeth watched in amazement as Max's fur began to glow subtly, as if each hair on his body had become a conductor of light and sound. "The Valdez," Aurora explained, "always knew that the true guardian of the system wouldn't be a person. It would be a being whose loyalty and connection to the place transcended human limitations." The sealed wall began to open slowly, revealing an inner chamber that glowed with a crystalline blue light. In its center, suspended in the air, floated a unique crystal, larger and more complex than all the others. "The heart," Richard whispered. "The master crystal that coordinates the entire system." Max stopped in front of the crystal, his collar pulsing in perfect sync with the glow of the core. The holograms showed something amazing. The frequencies emitted by the dog were restoring and strengthening the deepest connections of the system. "He's not just stabilizing the tunnels," Elizabeth realized. "He's reactivating the original protections, the ones the Founders designed for the city to grow and adapt naturally." Aurora worked frantically on the control panel, integrating the new patterns. "The water, it's being redirected. The system is using the leaks to reinforce its own structures." Max emitted a final series of barks, each perfectly modulated to resonate with the master crystal. The collar projected a last sequence of symbols, which Aurora translated with tears in her eyes. "The true legacy is not in the secrets we keep, but in the wisdom we share," she read. It was the Founders' motto, the truth they hoped each generation would rediscover. The glow of the master crystal intensified, expanding to fill the entire chamber. The holograms showed something extraordinary. The complete network of tunnels began to pulse with new life, each section restoring and strengthening itself. Elizabeth knelt beside Max, who finally allowed himself to show his exhaustion. "You did it," she whispered, hugging the dog. "You not only saved the city, you showed us its true heart." But as the system stabilized and the immediate danger passed, one last revelation awaited. In Max's collar, a secret compartment opened, revealing a final message from Jack, written years ago, when he was just beginning to understand the true magnitude of what he had discovered. The truth contained in that message would forever change everyone's understanding of the purpose, not only of the tunnels, but of their own connection to the living history of the city. With trembling hands, Elizabeth carefully unfolded the small note that had been hidden in Max's collar. Jack's familiar handwriting filled the page. "My dearest Elizabeth, if you're reading this, it means Max has fulfilled his most important mission. Not just as a guardian of secrets or a witness to hidden truths, but as a bridge between two worlds, the ancient and the modern, the past and the present. When I discovered the truth about the tunnels, I realized that some secrets are too important to be used as weapons. The real power isn't in controlling information, but in understanding how it connects us all. Max wasn't chosen at random. The Valdez, through generations, had prophesied the arrival of a special guardian, one who could see beyond human ambitions. Aurora knew it from the first day she saw him, and that's why she helped me prepare him for this moment. The system we've reactivated today isn't just a network of tunnels and archives. It's the very heartbeat of the city, a living organism that grows and evolves with each generation. The founders understood that true preservation isn't about keeping things exactly as they were, but allowing them to transform while maintaining their essence. Forgive me for the years of absence, for the pain I caused you. Each day away from you was a necessary sacrifice to protect something greater than ourselves. But Max never stopped being our link, our reminder that love and loyalty transcend time and distance. With all my love, Jack. Aurora, who had been monitoring the systems, announced with an emotional voice, "The stabilization is complete. The tunnels aren't just safe, they're stronger than ever." Richard, observing the holograms showing the restored network, nodded with a mixture of admiration and remorse. All this time I sought power in the wrong secrets. The true strength of this place was always in its capacity to unite, not divide. The crystals in the chamber now pulsed with a soft and constant rhythm, like a heart beating in perfect harmony. Max, exhausted but satisfied, lay down next to Elizabeth, his mission finally complete. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked, gently stroking Max while looking at Aurora. "The tunnels will remain a living archive," Aurora responded, "but this time they'll serve their true purpose, preserving and sharing knowledge, not hiding it. The founders' legacy will continue, but in the way they always desired." Jack approached Elizabeth, gently taking her hand. "And we," he murmured, "have a second chance. Not just to rebuild what we lost, but to be part of something greater." Max raised his head, his collar emitting one last soft flash. The symbols on the walls glowed once more, as if the city itself was nodding to this new beginning. Months later, the tunnels had become a center for research and historical preservation, open to scholars and citizens alike. Richard, serving his sentence, dedicated his time to helping catalog and restore documents, finding redemption in the same knowledge he once tried to control. Elizabeth and Jack gradually rebuilt their relationship, strengthened by the understanding that their story was part of a larger fabric, a narrative that intertwined with that of the city itself. And Max, the faithful guardian who had united all the threads of this story, continued his vigil no longer as a protector of secrets, but as a living symbol that loyalty, love and truth will always find their way to the light. The collar, now a reminder of his extraordinary mission, rested in a place of honor in the main chamber, its light softly pulsing to the rhythm of the city's heart, reminding everyone that the true treasures are not those we keep, but those we share.